Chapter 29. Aran. The scene outside the cabin was pure chaos. People running and screaming, soldiers with guns shouting orders, some trying to regain control of the situation, others simply shoving past everyone else in a blind attempt to get to the escape shuttles first. Aran and Istvay pushed their way through the mayhem to the cabin where Inez and Josip had been locked up. Their lock, too, it seemed, had been fried by the power surge, and Istvay yanked the door open. "Come on," shouted Aran. "We're getting off the ship, now." To their credit, Josip and Inez didn't pause to ask questions, just jumped to their feet and followed Aran and Istvay out the door. "What in the system?" began Josip, in tones of shock as he surveyed the chaos around them. "The ship's breaking up! Let's talk about it when we're on an escape pod," snapped Istvay. As the four of them approached the lifts, they slowed. The space around them was crammed with pushing, shouting people, the lifts themselves so full that the lift doors couldn't close, hanging uselessly open and unable to move. Istvay swore. "What the hell are they doing?" "The ship's officers were probably locked up too, at least the ones who weren't on Kavako's payroll," said Aran grimly. "No one to keep things organized." Istvay sighed, glancing around in indecision. "We can't just leave them like this." Aran yanked a flare out of his pouch. "Look, take this, shoot it off. When you have their attention, get them moving down the stairs. You can mark the path like we do when we're trying to get ground pigs out of their burrows. I have a set of the marker lights here." He dug through his supplies pouch. Istvay glared at him. "And what the hell will you be doing?" Aran looked up, shoving a handful of marker lights into Istvay's hands. "Crank the setting up. To the brightest they'll go. It should be enough to attract their attention. I'm going back for the judge and Failue. I'll meet you at the pod we were originally going to take. It's on the deck, above where the shuttles are, so it'll probably be less crowded there. I already loaded it with some of my supplies." Istvay hesitated, and Aran could see they wanted to insist on coming with him. But the pallor of their face and the slight trembling in their hands made it clear that they weren't going to be all that much use, and they knew it as well as he did. Instead, they muttered, "You can't damn well go back there by yourself. You'll bloody get killed in this crowd." Aran shook his head in exasperation. "I'm pretty sure I remember someone telling me, just a few minutes ago, that even though I might be a pretty crap option, I'm the only—" "Josip can help Istvay get people to the loading docks," said Inez in a small voice. "I'll go with Aran." Both Aran and Istvay turned to glare at her reflexively, and she shrank under their combined gaze. Aran sighed and forced the irritation from his expression. "Thank you, Inez. That's a good idea." He turned to Josip. "Can you—" Josip was smiling that irrepressible smile, the wrinkles around the corners of his eyes deepening. "I'm not a famous explorer, but I think I can take instructions from one." "Good," said Aran. "Istvay, once people are heading for the loading deck, get the hell out of here, okay?" Istvay gave a brusque nod. Their lips were pinched tight, but they didn't argue. Aran took a deep breath, then plunged back into the crowd, heading towards the Chief Justice's cabin. He shouldered his way through the rushing torrent of people, Inez following in his eddy. It felt like pushing upstream through a neck-deep river, and more than once he thought he'd be bowled over. Once, someone bumped into him so hard that he almost lost his balance, and only Inez catching him and shoving him back upright kept him from being pulled under and trampled. At the very least, he thought grimly, Kavako's soldiers, who he saw now and again through the crowd, seemed too worried about saving their own damn lives to try to kill anyone. The crowd thinned as the two of them pushed through the general section of the ship towards the diplomatic quarters, and Aran frowned as he and Inez broke into a sprint. There were hundreds of people on this floor. Surely they hadn't all... And then he noticed the external locks on the doors and swore. Inez turned to him in barely concealed panic, and he gestured with his head to the doors. "It looks like the soldiers locked everyone up and didn't bother to release the locks before they ran off. The power surge killed the locks in our sector. Looks like in this one, it locked down the emergency system instead." Inez's eyes grew wide with horror as she realized what he'd said. "You mean they were just going to—" Aran nodded. They were going to leave them to die. Let's get to Alba first, and then we'll deal with this. Inez gave him a quick, frightened nod, and they ran on. The blaring of the alarms was like a physical force pounding against his head, stopping him from thinking. They skidded to a stop outside the judge's door. "Stand back," said Aran over his shoulder. He ran a hand lightly over the exterior lock, feeling for the mechanism. When he found it, he grabbed a detonator from his pouch and fastened it to the surface, then tapped on the door. "Chief Justice," he shouted, "can you hear me? This is Aran and Inez. If you can hear me, stand back. I'm going to blow the lock." He stepped back sharply and hit the controller. There was the quiet pop of the detonator, and then the active light on the lock flickered and died. He stepped forward, jerking the door open. "The ship's breaking up. We need to get out, now." Alba stood at the door, looking older than he remembered, her face set and grim. "I'm afraid," she said quietly, her voice barely audible in the shriek of the alarms, "that it won't be quite as easy as that." She gestured behind her, and Aran frowned. The cabin was too dark to make out the interior properly. The lights must have gone out in the breakup, but there was blood on the floor. "What?" he began, his eyes flicking to Alba to check for injuries. "Madam, I may have been injured, but I'm not quite ready to die just yet," came Feliu's weak voice from within. "Nonsense," snapped Alba over her shoulder. She turned back to Aran. "He decided to be a hero and got shot. He's lost a lot of blood, I'm afraid. I don't know enough about first aid to know how bad the wound is." Aran swore under his breath and pushed past her into the cabin, squeezing the light on his palm screen to illuminate the small space. Felia was propped up against a wall, his face pale and blood staining his shirt. Aran crouched beside him, yanking out his metascanner, and took a brief scan. He glanced at the readout just long enough to assure himself the wound wasn't immediately fatal, then turned back to Feliu. "I'm sorry," he said. "We have to go. I'll help you stand." "Be careful," Alba snapped from the doorway. "If we don't bloody get him out, he's going to die here anyways," said Aran through his teeth as he hoisted Feliu to his feet. "We have an hour at most before this whole damn ship breaks apart." Feliu grunted in pain, his face drawn, but with Aran's arm around his back, he managed to stagger out of the cabin. When they were all gathered in the corridor, Aran looked up and down at the closed doors, teeth clenched. "I'll take them. You get the doors," came a small voice by his elbow, and he jerked around, startled. Inez stood there, her face fixed and determined. He hesitated half a second, then nodded, shifting Feliu's weight from his own shoulder to hers. The man moaned again, sweat standing out on his forehead, and Inez staggered a bit under his weight. She was a slight girl, and Feliu was no lightweight, but she caught her balance. "You know how to get back?" asked Aran. Inez nodded grimly, then gestured with her head. "Follow me," she said, and started forwards. Alba hesitated, then went after her. "Tell Istve I'll catch you up as soon as I can," he called after them. Then he reached into his pouch, pulled out a handful of detonators, and started down the hallway. He blew the lock on the next cabin down the hall, yanked the door open, and shouted, "Get down to the loading dock, quick as you can! Take the stairs, the lifts are no good, go!" The older man huddled inside, didn't wait to be told twice, just jerked to his feet and started down the corridor. By the time Aran reached the end of the long hallway, the unsteady movement of the ship under his feet told him better than words that their time was running out. "Aran!" came Istve's voice in his earpiece. "Where the hell are you?" "I'm on my way," he said, squeezing his hand to activate his own wavelink. "Just getting people out." "We don't have any more damn time," Istve hissed. "Get the hell down here." Aran glanced around him uncertainly. There were more corridors he hadn't checked, where the doors may or may not be unlocked. "I swear to you, Aran, if you don't promise me right now that you're on your way, I'm damn well coming after you." Aran let out a quick breath. "Fine, I'm on my way. Did the others make it?" "Yes, we're heading to the pod. Meet us there." Aran took one more quick glance around, but Istve was right. There wasn't time to explore the ship and see which cabins were open. He'd just have to hope that the other locks had broken, like they had in his and Istvay's sector, rather than sealed shut, like they had in the diplomatic quarters. He turned and started back down the corridor at a run. The passageway to the upper deck, where the smaller escape pods were stored, was much less busy than the clogged corridors leading to the stairs to the loading dock, and Aran only had to dodge around one or two people on his way to the stairwell. The deserted corridors were almost eerie, his footsteps echoing, no noise of shouting or talking to cut the high-pitched wail of alarms. Just get to the stairs, meet up with Istvay. The two of them could figure things out from there. He'd almost reached the stairwell when a voice stopped him. "Aran!" He whirled around, the knot in his stomach tightening. He recognized that voice. Emmerich stood in the passageway, a wild look in his eyes, but the pistol in his hand was steady and it was pointed directly at Aran. Chapter 30. Alba. Alba, Inez, and Feliu stumbled down the hallway in the direction Aran had indicated. It wasn't crowded at first, but it was only a few moments before other panicking people were running up from behind them, pushing past in a desperate effort to get to the stairs, and soon they were wading through a sea of absolute chaos. Beside Alba, Inez stumbled as someone shoved past her, and more came in their wake. Feliu gave a gasp of pain as the girl almost lost her footing, and Alba reached out unconsciously to catch them both. The weight of them made her stagger, but she pushed herself upright. "Inez, get behind me," she snapped. But you—" "Do as you're told." This time the girl did, pulling Feliu with her to stand behind Alba. Alba took a deep breath and stepped forward, pulling herself to her full height and planting herself in the middle of the tide of bodies. "Step away from us this minute!" she shouted, with every ounce of authority she'd accumulated from her decades on the council. It almost wasn't enough. The people around her paused, taken aback, and then surged forwards again, panic stronger than any lingering capacity for intimidation. But it gave the three of them enough space to push through to the corridor wall, where they were sheltered somewhat. Feliu sagged against Inez, his eyes half closed, blood leaking through the front of his shirt. Inez's shirt, as well, was streaked with blood, and the girl's hands were wet with it. Alba fought back the sharp sting of panic, forcing her mind calm. "Inez, where are we going? I'll lead." The girl nodded and whispered the coordinates, and Alba narrowed her eyes and started forwards. "Activate!" she snapped into her wavelength. "Josip, where are you?" "Madam?" It was strange how the sound of that voice, with its friendly, cheerful overtone even through the grimness, sent a rush of visceral relief through her. "We're on our way, but Feliu is injured and we're struggling to get through to the stairs." There was a moment's pause. "We'll meet you by the stairwell then," said Josip at last. "It's on our way." Alba deactivated the wavelength and glanced behind her. Feliu's face was completely bloodless now, his breaths ragged and gasping. He was leaning against Inez so heavily that Alba could see the girl's legs trembling under his weight. "Let me help you," she said, stepping back beside Inez and draping Feliu's other arm over her own shoulder. "Madam?" he choked, but she gave a sharp shake of her head. "You, Feliu, will be quiet, and you will do as you're told until we get you somewhere safe," she said grimly. "And right now, I am instructing you to lean on me so that we can get down this damned corridor and up to the shuttles." He nodded weakly, and she could feel him trying and failing to straighten at the tone in her voice. She could tell they were getting closer as the mass of people packed more heavily into the corridor, any semblance of order turning into frantic chaos. And then she heard Istvay's voice, weak, but still loud enough to ring out over the noise. "For hell's sake, down the damn stairs! Line up and stop damn well pushing, and you'll all have a chance to get off this bloody wreck." They were standing at the stairwell, a point of stillness in the rushing, eddying chaos, and beside them she could make out the bristly gray of Josip's head. Alba raised her voice desperately. "Josip!" she shouted. "Istvay!" She saw both their heads turning, searching for her, but neither could see her through the press. "Josip!" she shouted again, louder this time. Bodies were pushing up against her, dragging the three of them forward against their will. Inez was gasping with effort, and Alba could feel herself being pulled away from the girl in Feliu, despite her desperate efforts. And then the two at the stairwell must have seen her, and Istve was pushing their way through the crowd towards her. "Where's Aran?" they snapped as they reached her, looking around quickly, as if expecting Aran to be bringing up the rear. The doors in the diplomatic section were sealed closed. "He said he was going to try to get people out," said Inez in a low voice. Istve swore. "I'm going after him," they began, but Josip shook his head, placing a hand on their arm. "You can't. You won't do any good. And by the time you reach there, if he hasn't started back, neither of you will stand a chance. Let's get to the escape pod and hold a place for him. That's the best we can do." Istve's face was cut with indecision. At last, though, they nodded, squeezing their palm screen to activate the wavelink. "Aran, where the hell are you?" they said through gritted teeth, leaning over to take Feliu's weight off Alba's shoulders. They staggered a little as they took the weight, and Alba was reminded that they'd been poisoned scant days before. They managed to straighten, though, jerking their head forward, and Alba and the others fell in behind them as they shoved through the crowd. "We want to get to the upper deck," Istve shouted over their shoulder. "The escape pod Aran and I were preparing is up there." Alba frowned. Istve scowled. "Not important right now. Let's go." She bristled at the tone in their voice, but they were right. She swallowed her retort and nodded. The general's soldiers were mingled in with the crowd, and fistfights had broken out here and there. She turned at a sudden, gasping scream, just in time to watch a soldier yank out his pistol and fire directly into the face of the woman beside him, a woman Alba recognized vaguely as one of the diplomatic aides. She turned quickly away, feeling sick. "Are you all right?" asked Josip, turning to her with concern, but she pressed her lips shut and nodded. There would be time to think about all this later. In the meantime, the important thing was to keep moving. Pushing up the stairwell, past the steady flood of people stumbling in the opposite direction, was a terrifying, breathtaking endeavor. But between Istve's bull-headed shoving, Inez's terrified stubbornness, and Josip's sturdy frame, they managed it, and finally pushed out into another corridor. Istve came to a sudden halt. "We can't go this way," they said, tension bleeding through their tone. Peering past them, Alba could see why. The corridor was completely packed, a mass of frantic, pushing, struggling people. "We'll have to go all the way around," said Istve grimly. They hesitated, clearly reluctant. "If we go up one floor, maybe two if we need to, we may be able to get across the ship and come down on the other side, but it'll take a lot longer and I don't know how much time we have." I think I know another way. That might be a little faster," whispered Inez, her voice trembling. Alba turned to her. "Yes, tell us." Inez's face was stricken, and Alba, sighing internally, added, "Your ideas so far have been good, and I have no doubt this one is as well." Alba wasn't sure if that actually lessened the stunned look on the girl's face, but Josip shot Alba a quick, approving smile, and she was surprised at the warmth in it. If we go down that corridor back there, it'll take us through to the main deck. I know it will be crazy there, but it's a lot of open space. So if we stick to the edges, we should be able to get through. There are crew ladders there that lead up to the emergency docks." Istve nodded brusquely and turned, only staggering a little as they pushed back towards the corridor Inez had indicated. Alba and the others followed in their wake. Inez's intuition had been correct. Once the group of them were able to break through to the relatively clear passageway, they went at a stumbling half-run. Alba's breath caught painfully in her chest, her heart pounding at the unaccustomed exertion. And then they were there, and Istve shoved back the door onto the main deck. As Inez had predicted, the main deck, though crowded, was large enough that they could weave their way across the floor, even with Istve half-carrying Feliu and staggering with the effort. The muscles stood out in their arms and shoulders as they supported his weight, and despite everything, Alba smiled faintly to herself. She might be 73, but she still had eyes. She could guess at least one reason Aran was so obviously smitten by this one. When they reached the ladder, Istve stumbled to a halt, panting. "Feliu isn't going to be able to—" Josip began. Istve nodded, their face grim, and without a word, bent and hoisted Felu bodily up onto their shoulders. Felu gasped in pain. Istve grunted at the effort, but straightened unsteadily, grabbing onto the ladder for support. "I'll go up, then I'll help the rest of you," they said, voice strained. Despite the fact they'd been poisoned mere days ago, they were still the most physically capable of the group. It was a depressing thought. Alba watched with trepidation as Istve scaled the ladder, their pace agonizingly slow, and then lowered Felu to the ground, where he lay gasping, his face almost gray. "Madam Chief Justice?" said Josip, gesturing her forward. Alba stepped up to the ladder and took a deep breath, steeling herself. Her legs were shaking so hard by now, with a combination of nerves and exhaustion, she wasn't sure her knees wouldn't simply give out on her, but she grasped the rungs of the ladder in both hands and, sending up a quick prayer to the Great Mystery, started up. Halfway up, her hand slipped, but Istve, down on their belly and leaning over the edge, caught her wrist before she could fall. They half helped, half pulled her up the rest of the way, their face pale with the strain. Inez scrambled up next, followed by Josip, and then Istve had hauled Felu back to his feet, and the group of them set off again at a stumbling run. As they rounded the corner to the pod station, Alba could feel the tight knot of tension that was choking off her breath begin to loosen. Most of the people on the ship must have scrambled for the emergency shuttles, which were both larger and more capable of surviving for an extended period of time in space. There were surprisingly few people gathered around the smaller individual pods. And then she slowed, a sudden weight forming in her stomach. In front of her, Istve staggered to a halt, Felu groaning faintly against their shoulder. Half a dozen soldiers stood in front of the airlock door. Their guns were trained on the 5 of them, and there was a look on their faces that told Alba they wouldn't hesitate to use them. Chapter 31. Aran. Aran glanced around, then yanked open a door to one of the supply cupboards, placing it between himself and Emmerich. It was thick enough, probably, that Emmerich's shot wouldn't get through it. "Emmerich, get out of the way," he said. His teeth were gritted, his heart pounding. Emmerich had killed Ani. But there was no time to think of that now. Emmerich still hadn't moved, his pistol held steady. "The ship is breaking up, Emmerich." Aran tried to keep his voice calm, like he was soothing a frightened animal. "Whatever it is you want, you can't get it if we're both dead. Just get out of the way, and we can deal with this later." From somewhere below him, he could hear the hiss of loading doors opening, releasing the first of the emergency shuttles. Emmerich's face was drawn with terror, but there was a fixed determination under the fear on his face. "I'm sorry, Aran," he said. "I wish I didn't have to do this. I've never wanted to kill you. I just wanted you to stay out of the way. But you wouldn't. You don't understand the stakes. You have to die." Aran stared at him. "The portal has closed. We're all stranded here, and the ship is breaking up. Every last damn one of us is going to die if we don't get off. This isn't the time or place to worry about whose damn side anyone's on. Just move over and let me past. We can both get to an escape pod. There's still time." He moved as if to start forward, but Emmerich stepped in his way again, pistol held steady. "I'm sorry. I have to kill you. I don't have a choice. But I don't have to kill anyone else, not even Istve. I won't do anything to stop them. I promise. I won't even try to stop the Chief Justice. If you don't try to fight, everyone else can walk away from this." The ship shuddered as if to punctuate his words, and both of them staggered. Aran's breath was coming too quickly. Damn it to hell, he didn't have time for this. Neither of them did. Maybe it had all been too much for Emmerich. Maybe watching Ani kill his companions had been too much, and Emmerich's mind had broken from the strain. Gently, Aran eased his own pistol from the holster on his belt. "Don't," Emmerich snapped. "I know where Istve and the judge are. I have my people stationed in front of your escape pod, and they've been instructed not to let your friends pass until I give the word. Step out where I can see you, show me you're not going to fight, and I'll give the word. I swear it. I don't mean them any harm. But I need you dead." For a long moment, they stared at each other. There was a cold knot in Aran's stomach, and he found his hands shaking. Emmerich wasn't crazy after all, and he wasn't bluffing. Aran had seen this expression on him before when they were classmates. There was something he wanted, something he thought he deserved, and he'd step over the body of anyone who got in his way without so much as a twinge of conscience. Istve was down there, and Inez and Josip. They were headed for the pods, and they had no idea there were soldiers waiting for them. "If you say so much as a word through your wavelength, I'll tell my soldiers to shoot them down," said Emmerich, as if reading his mind. "I told you I don't need them dead, but by the mystery itself, I wouldn't shed a single tear for them either." He took a step closer. "You can save them, though. It'll be easy, you won't feel a thing. I don't hate you, despite what Istve thinks. This is only business. Don't let someone else die for you." And just for a moment, Aran almost did it. For a moment, he pictured Ani, that glimpse of her tentacles slipping from the airlock door. The look on Istve's face when they woke that morning, years ago, and their mother didn't, the drawn, skeletal outline of her body that still woke Aran from nightmares. The way Istve's face was slowly gathering the ghost of that same look, day by inexorable day. Istve would get off the ship, and they'd take Inez and Josip and the others with them. Istve would be safe. Except they wouldn't. Not really. Whatever General Cavaco had decided to do, it was obvious that Emmerich, at least, believed it wasn't over. And who knew what awaited the others, if the rest of them did find a planet to land their pod? Istve was smart, but Istve was still recovering from being poisoned. And none of the others had any damn idea how to keep themselves alive in the field. He'd be willing to bet on that. He gritted his teeth and swore quietly. Damn Istve to hell. If they hadn't harassed him half to death in the cabin, maybe he could have just stepped out into the corridor with a clear conscience. But he couldn't. He'd failed Ani. He'd failed Istve's mother. Maybe Emmerich was right, and he was nothing but a useless failure after all. But he was all Istve and the others damn well had, and he couldn't bloody leave them. He took a deep breath. Then he threw himself forward, yanking his pistol out as he went. Emmerich stepped back in surprise, and Aran slammed into him. "Activate!" Emmerich began in a choked voice. Then Aran hit him in the mouth with the butt of his pistol. He winced as blood spurted from Emmerich's nose, but he couldn't let him get through to the soldiers. Emmerich's hand grabbed for Aran's neck, his grip surprisingly strong, and Aran barely managed to shove him aside. Emmerich lunged upwards, shoving Aran off him, then turned, dropping his knee into Aran's stomach. Aran grunted in pain, the breath knocked out of him. "Activate!" Emmerich mumbled again. "Captain Da Costa, you need to—" Aran grabbed Emmerich by the shoulders and shoved, using his momentum to roll them over until he was on top again. He grabbed Emmerich's hair and slammed his head into the deck, and his words choked off. "Sorry, Emmerich," he gasped. "I told Istve I was going to meet them. I'm not going to let you make me a liar, so you're going to have to get out of the way or we're both going to die here." Emmerich struggled, trying to break free, and managed to yank a hand out of Aran's grip. He grabbed for something, then slapped his open palm against Aran's shoulder. Something sharp and painful jolted through Aran's entire body. For a split second, he wondered if Emmerich had been holding a knife, or maybe a needle with a nerve poison. He tried to move, only to find his muscles frozen. An electric trank. He'd used them before on animals, if it was that or let them be killed, but he hated it. Despite the professional reassurances, he hadn't been able to imagine an electric current running through your muscles, even one routed specifically to avoid cardiac damage, wouldn't be painful. Apparently he'd been correct. Emmerich rolled out from under him, shoving him off to one side. Aran couldn't move, couldn't speak, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached from the pressure, couldn't even turn his head to see what Emmerich was going to do next. Still, that probably wasn't necessary. Emmerich had made his intentions abundantly clear. From the corner of his eye, he saw Emmerich stagger to his feet. He was bleeding from the mouth and nose, bruises already rising on his face, but even through the blood and mess, the cold hatred in his eyes shone out like a flare. He'd said this wasn't personal, but Aran realized suddenly he'd been lying. Istve had been right all along. Emmerich hated him, and from the look of it, that hatred had taken on the sheen of religious fervor. Emmerich steadied himself against the corridor wall for a moment, wiping the blood from his face with his sleeve, then reached into a holster at his belt and pulled out another pistol. Aran's heart pounded, his stomach a cold, sick knot. He didn't want to die. He hadn't realized until just now how much he didn't want to die. But then that wasn't really up for discussion anymore. He'd done what he could, and it hadn't been enough. From behind Emmerich, in the direction of the loading docks, came a strange hissing sound, hardly loud enough to be audible over the alarms. Aran tried to frown, but the muscles in his face were too frozen to allow for it. Maybe he was imagining things. The hissing grew louder. He strained to move his head even a couple centimeters, but he couldn't. He wasn't imagining things, though. Emmerich had half-turned, glancing in the direction of the noise. And then Emmerich's face went completely bloodless. He shoved the pistol back into his belt, and Aran heard his panicked footsteps pounding away down the corridor. Aran's heart was pounding fast and uneven, his pulse loud in his ears. Whatever the hell it was, he wasn't going to get away from it. Or maybe it wasn't something coming at all, just the sound of the pressure breaking somewhere ahead of him, and he'd be sucked out into deep space. Another frozen testament to the brutality of whatever the hell lurked behind the portal. Something touched his arm, and he would have flinched if his muscles weren't held solid by the current. It touched him again, and he thought maybe he'd actually pass out in terror. And then, whatever it was, gave a soft, chirruping purr, and for a moment he wondered if maybe he'd died after all, and this was some sort of post-death hallucination. The gentle, probing tentacles, he recognized the touch now, even though it was completely impossible, moved down his arm until they reached the device Emmerich had slapped onto his arm. "No, Ani, that'll hurt you," he tried to say through gritted teeth, but of course no sound came out. There was a small jolt from the device, and Ani's tentacle jerked back, then touched the thing again. And then she growled happily, her tentacle suckers closing down on it, and suddenly, Aran was free. He jerked upright, staring around wildly. Ani was sitting on the floor beside him, patterns of bright electric colors rippling through her body in soft undulations as she purred in contentment. For a few moments, he just stared at her, too flabbergasted to form a thought. "Ani?" he said at last. She turned to him, and there was the quick, electric jolt through his body as she let go her hold on the trank device for just a moment. The shock of it brought Aran back to himself, and he reached over and broke the thing free of his skin. Ani grumbled, the electric patterns wavering out through her tentacles and dying. "Ani!" His voice was choked in a mixture of disbelief and happiness. "Ani! How the hell? I saw you die!" He picked her up as he spoke, turning her over gently to inspect her for injuries. She was battered, and he could see 6 small cuts on her body. There was an odd glint under one of her tentacles, and he turned the tentacle over and examined the suction cups more closely. There were bits of metal caught in them, a smooth, shiny silver color. "Ani?" he said again, frowning. "Is this from the ship's hull? Did you—" He broke off, staring at her. "Ani, how did you survive that? It's impossible for a life form to survive in space without a suit. At least that's what we've always assumed." He pulled one of the metallic slivers gently free and turned it over in his fingers, a sudden excitement welling in his chest. He'd have to test it to be sure, of course, but on a cursory examination it looked like the same material as the hull of the ship. "Were you out there this whole time?" he asked, turning back to Ani. She'd settled herself in his lap and was pushing her bulbous head under his hand, begging for pets. "How the hell—" Of course, the airlock doors had been opening and closing almost non-stop for the last half hour, ever since people started getting off the ship. Hypothetically, if she'd managed to attach herself to the hull, she could have crawled inside when one of the external doors opened, then come through to the ship's interior after the external door closed and the internal one reopened. What this would mean to science, what they could learn from a creature who could survive in deep space. The ship shuddered again, and he started, glancing around. Ani might be able to survive in deep space, but he damn well couldn't. "Come on, Ani, we'd better go. We'll talk more about this later," he said. He held out his arm, and as she pulled herself to his shoulder, he scrambled to his feet. Then, with one last glance around, he sprinted down the corridor towards where Istvay and the others would be waiting. Chapter 32. Alba. "What is this?" Istvay asked the soldiers in a voice that was trying to be calm. But something about their tone told Alba that Istvay had guessed exactly what this was. So had she. Despite the cold in her stomach, spreading slowly down her limbs and through her body, she stepped forward and touched Istvay on the shoulder. They turned, frowning at her, and she gave them her most imperious glance, even though she was still gasping for breath. "Let me, if you'd be so kind." Istvay hesitated a moment, then, apparently reading the look in her face, stepped back so she was standing at the front of the tiny, ragged group, facing the soldiers. Her legs were still trembling badly, adrenaline pulsing sick and heavy through her body, but she refused to put out a hand to support herself against the wall. "Soldiers," she demanded, "please explain the meaning of this at once." The soldiers didn't answer, just shifted their grips on their weapons, their postures ready, faces grim. "You aren't to come any closer," said the captain, her voice cold and businesslike. "Alba, it's fine," said Istvay, their tones strained. "We'll find another pod, and I'll come back here to tell Aran where we—" The captain jerked her head at her subordinates, and they spread out, blocking off the exits. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "We've been ordered to hold you here. You're not to get onto an escape pod until I'm given the word. Come, now. None of us want to die on this ship, us or your soldiers," said Josip, stepping up beside Alba. "If there's a problem, I'm certain we can work it out once we've solved the immediate issue." His smile was as friendly as always, but the calm in his expression was belied by the worry under his tone. "You need to get your soldiers out of this alive, and I'm sure you as their captain wouldn't willingly bring them to harm. You're welcome to this pod. Just let us go and we'll find another. No one needs to know we were here, and whoever is giving you orders can't possibly argue that you didn't do your duty by keeping yourself and your soldiers safe." "Shut up," the woman snapped, "or you'll be the first one I shoot." Alba glared at the woman, surprised by her own unexpected surge of anger. From the corner of her eye, she saw a hint of motion, Istvay's hand reaching slowly for their pistol. But it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't be enough. There were 6 soldiers. No matter how good Istvay was, it would turn into a massacre. She straightened her shoulders and fixed the captain with her iciest stare. "You," she began, her tone crackling with a mix of icy formality and haughty indignation, "will address me as Madam Chief Justice, if you please. I happen to be one of the joint heads of your government, and while you may answer to the general, his authority ultimately passes through the council, and therefore through me. I am not accustomed to being disobeyed." The woman stared at her. "I am not accustomed to being spoken to in this manner. And I am not accustomed to being treated like this," Alba snapped, her temper rising with her words. "I am embarrassed by you, and I am embarrassed by every soldier on this ship. I had expected better of any person who claimed to act in the name of our government. I have, and always have had, nothing but respect for the efforts of our soldiers to keep peace throughout the system. But I had been led to believe that legitimate soldiers followed the proper chain of command. You, young woman, are a disgrace to your company and a disgrace to our system, following orders that you know are seditious in order to gain standing with someone in the process of committing treason. You can't tell me this is what you are taught in our military academies. Your instructors would be ashamed of you. I am ashamed of you." The woman was still staring. Alba took a step forward, drawing herself up to her full, if not particularly impressive, height. "As your head of government," she said, enunciating each word, "I demand that you get out of my way." She turned to the other soldiers. "And you! Stop embarrassing yourselves. Put down your weapons this instant." There was a moment of silence. The soldiers' faces were slack with shock. Alba turned back to the captain and had to hold herself back from starting in surprise. Behind the captain, her face screwed into an expression of miserable determination. Inez was raising a piece of broken metal tubing, gripping it tightly enough that the tendons in her hands stood out against her skin. Alba grasped her composure with an iron grip and resolutely avoided looking at the girl. "Furthermore," she began, but she was flustered, and her voice had lost its tone of command. "What do you think?" the captain began, rallying. Inez swung the metal tubing like a bat, slamming it into the side of the captain's head with enough force to knock the woman sideways and send Inez staggering backwards. The captain landed hard on the corridor floor, and Josip stepped neatly past Alba and plucked the rifle from her nerveless fingers. From the corner of her eye, Alba saw Istvay snatching the guns from the hands of stunned soldiers, their own pistol held steady at the soldiers' faces. It was over in moments. Josip had turned the captain's gun on the disarmed soldiers, and Inez had grabbed a gun from Istvay and was pointing it at the fallen captain with a shaky determination. Istvay's breath was still coming quickly, their eyes narrowed, violence in their expression, and a gun in their hand. Josip stepped up beside them, shaking his head gently. "Let these people go. They're not worth our lives." Istvay hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded. Josip turned to the captain. She was lying where she'd fallen, blinking blood from her eyes, her expression dazed. "I'm sure you're a good woman," he said quietly. "You were doing what you thought was your duty, but you've lost. Now get your soldiers out of here before anyone gets killed. None of us have time to waste fighting." As if to punctuate his words, the ship shook violently, and through the plex in the interior airlock door, Alba saw a huge mass against the black of space. For a moment she stared at it, confused, before she realized what it was. The entire port section of the ship swinging ponderously to one side as it broke partially free. The captain staggered to her feet, hand pressed to the bloody wound on her head, and gestured curtly to her soldiers. They jumped forward to support her, and the whole half-dozen of them disappeared down the corridor. "Come on! Get in!" snapped Istvay, hitting the control. The airlock's interior door slid open, and Alba and the others stumbled inside, Istvay and Inez half dragging the unconscious Felyu between them. Istvay's hands were full between Felyu and the pistol they were still holding, but they harangued the others ahead of them into one of the tiny four-person pods, coming in last with Felyu and Inez. Alba looked around at the cramped space, meant for four, and already they were five and waiting for a sixth. Still, it couldn't possibly be worse than the alternative. She dropped wearily onto a bench. Inez and Istvay laid Felyu out on one of the open sleeping pods, and Josip dropped into the pilot's seat. A few moments later, the small pod hummed to life. Istvay glanced up quickly at the sound, their face set. "I'm going out to wait for Aran," they said shortly. "He's not answering his wavelink. He should have been here by now." Alba and Josip exchanged glances, but neither of them spoke. Alba could already tell it wouldn't do any good. They'd have to drag Istvay away kicking and fighting, and she, at least, wasn't physically capable of it. "From what I'm seeing on the readouts, we have maybe 3 minutes to get off before it's too late," said Josip quietly. "Then if I'm not back in 3 minutes, leave without me," said Istvay through their teeth and disappeared out the door. Again, Alba and Josip exchanged glances. The seconds dragged by. 1 minute. 2. Josip was glancing back at the loading ramp where Istvay had disappeared, and she could see the strain and indecision on his usually cheerful face. Would he be able to bring himself to leave Istvay if it came to it? Alba was suddenly, sickeningly grateful that she wasn't the one who had to make that decision. 2.5 minutes. Josip pushed himself up out of the pilot's seat. "I'm going to," he began. And then Aran stumbled up the loading ramp and through the hatch, Istvay at his heels and that awful tentacled murder beast clinging to his shoulders. Istvay hit the control as they staggered in, and the hatch slammed shut, sealing with a hiss of pressure. "Go!" Istvay shouted, and Josip, who'd already slid back into the pilot's seat, hit the controls. The outer airlock doors slid open, and the escape pod launched itself free of the massive ship's death spasms and out into a cold, pitiless black expanse that was entirely and utterly unfamiliar. Alba kept her eyes fixed forward and refused to consider, just for now, the incalculable mass of humanity that was dying along with the ship. Chapter 33. Savina. At the first shock, Savina had rolled to her feet, trying instinctively to see if the door latch had been disabled, but it appeared to have sealed shut, stronger than even the lock her captors had set. She hadn't been able to try it more than half-heartedly anyways, with her hands bound, and the restraints on her wrist had been set to block off her wavelink. But they'd gone through the portal, she'd felt that, and whatever they'd found on the other side, something had happened to the ship. She could hear the shriek of alarms through the door, the panicked shouts, the orders to evacuate. And she knew, instinctively, that if something had happened, the soldiers wouldn't risk their own lives setting their prisoners free, so she sat in the corner of her small prison and waited to die. Being captured had been bad enough. Being captured had meant a trial, prison, possibly death, if the ship's captain or the judge decided bringing her back was more trouble than it was worth, and made it clear they'd turn a blind eye towards an accident in her cell. The thought made her mildly ill. She'd seen the hatred in that soldier's eyes. It wouldn't have been a quick death. But the others, at least, likely would have gone free eventually. There was nothing connecting Benny to Savina's crimes. Savina had made very, very sure of that. And Joska and Rafael, well, all they had to do was tell the truth. There was plenty of evidence of the veracity of their claims, and no one would disbelieve them, knowing Savina's history. But locked in the cabin on a ship that was being evacuated, there was nothing she could do to salvage this situation. She'd never realized until just that moment how afraid she was to die. She'd teased death her whole life, dancing along the edge of it like a rope dancer, reveling in the danger. But now that it had arrived, now that she'd lost her balance and was tumbling over the edge, she realized that the thing that fed the thrill, that brought the pleasant racing of her heart at a dangerous prospect, was terror. And she was plunging into it, over her head, drowning. Since she was a child, since she was 7 years old, holding a tiny, dirty, bundled baby in her arms, she'd never felt this cold fear, the kind that overtook her and curled itself around her until she was smothered in it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she wasn't sure if she was talking in her head to Benny or to Nicolau or to Rafael or to Joska, a woman who'd shown herself to be a truly good person, the kind of person Savina had never even aspired to be. There was a pounding on the cabin door, and Savina jerked her head up in shock. "Savina? Savina, are you in there?" For a moment, she just stared. Then she shouted, her voice cracking with desperate hope. "I'm here! Help me, please!" "I'm trying. Give me a moment." Savina recognized the rough voice with its dry humor. There was a small pop from outside. Then the door was yanked open and Joska stood silhouetted in the opening. Blood ran down her face and into her eyes from a shallow cut on her forehead, and she was bleeding from a long gash down one arm, but her grim face was somehow the most wonderful thing Savina had ever seen. Behind her stood Benny. Savina blinked at them for a moment, and for just a moment she thought she might start crying. "Come on," Joska snapped. "The ship's breaking up. We have to get off. The portal closed and the energy wave hit us hard. You and Benny head back to the ship. I'll meet you there." Savina jumped to her feet at the urgent tone in the woman's voice. "Benny," she said, "can you get the restraints off me?" Benny nodded and stepped forward, finding her unerringly. Their hand ran down Savina's arm until they located the restraint. Then they yanked a sparker from their pocket and clipped it on. A moment later, the restraint popped free. Savina rubbed her wrists, glancing up at Joska. "Where are you going?" Joska shook her head grimly. "I'm going back for Rafael. Benny found where he's being held, but I can't get through to him on the wavelink, so I have to assume he's locked up." She glanced at Savina. "If he and I aren't back and the ship looks like it's going, you two get out. Don't wait for us." She paused, a rueful smile pulling at her lips. "Although I suppose I don't have to tell the two of you that. You seem quite adept at saving your own skins." What she'd said was only the truth, and a week ago Savina would have accepted the offer without hesitation. But she found herself shaking her head. "No," she said, "I'm going with you to find Rafael." Joska stared at her. She rolled her eyes. "We have to find Nicolau anyways, and besides, I don't know how to pilot the damn ship." Joska's eyebrows, already raised, practically disappeared into her hairline, but she nodded gravely, a small smile twitching at the corners of her mouth. As you say. If Savina's going, so am I, said Benny, the softness of their voice betraying their own terror. Savina glanced at them reflexively, but one look at her sibling's face told her she wouldn't be able to talk Benny into staying behind, and there wasn't time to try. Joska glanced between the two of them, then gave a curt nod. I won't lie and say I wouldn't be grateful for your help. She jerked her head towards the long corridor. Let's go. They sprinted down the corridors, dodging around panicked clusters of people. Crew and passengers and soldiers mixed. The soldiers were screaming and shouting in a desperate, futile attempt to keep order, weapons out, some of them firing indiscriminately into the crowd in their panic. Joska slowed a moment, indecisive, then shook her head grimly and kept running. Rafel's being held in the port stern deck, floor 3, she said over her shoulder to Savina. Where's this Nicolau, or whoever he is? Benny, gasped Savina. Benny nodded grimly. I'm already scanning for him, they said. Should only be a minute or two more, I think. There are a lot of records to go through. Savina nodded and activated her own wavelink with a flick of her eyes. Directions to port stern deck, floor 3, she snapped, and a moment later a pulsing red dot blinked on her retinal screen over the transparent overlay of the ship's schematics. The translucent arrow in her field of vision pointed her down a side corridor. She followed it, and the others followed her. Shoving through the chaos got more difficult as they approached the center of the ship, near the exits to the emergency bays. But when Savina pulled out her longest knife and her widest smile, the crowds parted for them with surprising rapidity. The three of them weren't here for the escape shuttles anyway, so it wasn't as if they were trying to take a place in the corridors that anyone else was competing for. Joska glanced at Savina, eyebrows raised and a wry expression on her face, but didn't say anything. The crowds lessened as they neared the stern of the ship. Savina led them to a crew ladder and slid down, not taking the time to wait for the lift, then started down another empty corridor, the others' footsteps echoing behind her. Nicolau is on the main deck, Benny gasped out behind her. We'll have to get through there to get back to the Dolphin. Savina nodded. We'll grab him on our way out, if he hasn't already evacuated. The ship was shaking and groaning, the wail of alarms a wall of sound that pummeled her eardrums. Give me the coordinates to where Rafel's being held. A moment later, they popped up on her retinal screen. She turned down a corridor and pulled to a stop in front of a door the translucent marker on her screen had overlaid with a bright red. This one, she panted. Joska stepped past her and banged on the door. Rafel! Captain? There was disbelief in the familiar gruff tone. Stand back, I'm going to blow the lock, Joska said tersely. She clipped a small detonator to the door fastener. You two stand back as well, she said over her shoulder. She stepped back herself as she hit the controller, and there was a puff of smoke and a small pop. When the smoke cleared, the door was swinging loose. Joska yanked it open, and Rafel stumbled out. He looked worse for the wear, one eye swollen all the way shut, a bruise spreading across the side of his face. He cradled one arm as if it pained him, and his breaths came shallow and rough, probably a broken rib or a dozen. Come on, said Joska again, her voice tight, and he nodded and followed her out. Savina was certain she caught, just for a moment, the shine of tears in his eyes. The ship shook violently, and Savina was thrown against the corridor wall and Joska and Rafel thrown to the ground. What? The captain began, pulling herself painfully to her feet. The ship shuddered again, and they all grabbed instinctively for the walls. The hallway lights flickered and died, plunging them into complete darkness. Savina felt her feet leave the floor, that dizzying, disorienting sensation of zero gravity. They've lost emergency power, said Joska grimly from the darkness. All the emergency systems will be going soon. She paused a moment. There are handholds on the ceiling and walls for when the gravity system gives out. We'll have to use them. We don't have much time. Emergency lights flickered on, running along the sides of the corridors, and in the dim yellowish light, Savina could make out Benny, who'd already grasped the handholds. Of course, The echolocator in her sibling's wavelength wouldn't work any differently with or without light. The ship shuddered again, and Savina was jostled into Joska and Rafael. Benny reached out and grabbed Savina's arm, dragging her up to the handholds, and Savina grabbed on with both hands. Someone screamed from one of the cabins at the far end of the corridor. Joska turned back, but Savina grabbed the woman's arm and shoved her forwards. "There's no time! You said so yourself! We get out now or we die with them!" "We can't just..." Joska began, but Rafael shot Savina a grateful look and snapped, "Captain, she's right. You can't save whoever that is. By the time you got down there and set the detonator, you'd both have lost your chance to get out. And so would I, because I'm not damn well going without you. Come on." Joska's face was tight with indecision, but Savina didn't give her time to think about it, pushing herself forward along the handholds and dragging the captain behind her. By the time they got to the end of the corridor, Joska must have realized it was hopeless. She shook herself free of Savina's grip and grabbed the handles as well. She was better at it than Savina and Benny, and Savina tried to imitate her smooth motions, pull, glide, grab, pull, glide, grab, a little like the monkey bars she'd played on as a child in the worn-out playground in the compound. The ship was shaking, each jolt threatening to pull them free from the handholds. Savina clung on grimly, keeping an eye over her shoulder for Benny as she went, ready to grab her sibling if necessary. And then there was another jolt, even larger than the last two, and Joska's face went bloodless. "It's broken up," she choked. "We're too late." Savina glanced past her and saw, with a sick horror, what the captain meant. The entire port section of the ship had broken off, held to the main ship only by the slightly flexible interior lining. The lining itself was strained to its limits, the material groaning like a living thing in pain. It would be mere moments before it broke open, sucking them and everyone else on the port deck into deep space. And there was no way across the stretched broken section, no handholds, nothing. "I'll push Rafael across first," said Joska grimly. "If he makes it, I'll try with the rest of you." Savina gave a snort of exasperation and shoved past the woman, reaching into her belt. She pulled out a small cable gun and squinted, judging the distance. It should be long enough, barely. She depressed the trigger, and the compressed coils shot out, the magnetic tip catching the wall on the far side. Savina glanced around, then shoved the pistol through the largest of the handholds and twisted it around the cable, tying it as firmly as she was able. "Go!" she snapped, and the others didn't wait to ask questions, pulling themselves hand over hand along the cable. The groans from the strained interior lining grew to a sound akin to a shriek of pain. Savina pulled herself along faster, gritting her teeth against the enveloping terror that threatened to overwhelm her. And then they were at the other side, and she was pulling Benny and Rafael through and onto the handholds that led to the closed-off blast door. Joska swore, and Benny pushed past her, tapping something into their wavelength and then running their fingers down the door until they touched the lock. It spun, and the doors hissed open, and the four of them fell through, gravity once again in effect. Benny rolled to their feet, and Savina grabbed their hand, guiding it to the controls. Benny hit them frantically, and the noise of the door slamming shut was overshadowed by a grinding, tearing sound, the scream of tortured metal, as the entire port section of the ship broke free. Joska pulled Rafael to his feet, and the four of them took off at a dead run down the now almost deserted corridors. "Is that man you want to save still aboard?" the captain panted from ahead of her. "Benny!" Savina gasped. "He's still on board, still on the main deck," Benny called. Joska nodded and turned down a corridor. "It won't take any more time to get back to the Dolphin going through the main deck than around it, I don't think. But you damn well better find him quickly." From the screaming and shouting below them as they approached the deck, it was obvious that more people were trapped on board still than had gotten off. They broke through onto the main deck, and Savina muttered something into her wavelength. A moment later, a shining, translucent halo of red appeared on her retinal screen over the head of someone near the back of the crowd. Savina pulled out her knife and shoved her way through towards it. "Joska, take Benny and Rafael around the edge and meet me on the other side of the deck," she called over her shoulder. She pushed her way through the panicking crowd until she reached the tall, auburn-haired young man, his face drawn with shock and horror, and grabbed him by the arm. "What?" he began. She didn't give him time to finish, simply slapped a restraint on his wrist and jerked him along. "I'm trying to save your life," she hissed as she shoved him ahead of her. "Don't try to fight, or I'll damn well paralyze you." "But the others," he began. She sent a small warning shock through the restraint, and at last, his shoulders tight with strain, he let her push him forward. Joska and the others waited at the mouth of the corridor that led towards the hangar bay. When Savina reached them, they set off along it at a run, none of them bothering to speak. By the time they reached the hangar bay entrance, Savina's breath was sobbing in her throat, a sharp cramp like a knife between her ribs. Benny hit the control, and the doors slid open. A few dozen crew members, who must have been trapped inside, rushed for the opening, but Joska, too breathless to speak, held up a hand, gesturing to the ship. "Get on if you want to come with us," Rafael growled, pain making his gruff voice even harsher than usual. The hapless crew members glanced around in panic, then seemed to decide that any vessel that would get them off the dying behemoth was safety enough. Before the loading ramp was even finished lowering, they were scrambling on board, packing into the cramped space that had been built to house 5, maybe 6 people. Once everyone was inside, Savina hit the controls, sealing them in. Joska had pushed past Savina and was already on her way to the flight deck, Rafael close behind her. Savina snapped at the panicked crew members to sit still and shut up, then glowered at Nicola. "You can damn well make them behave," she said. Then she and Benny followed the captain. "Strap in if you can," Joska said briskly, over the amplifiers, her hands dancing across the controls. "Benny, if you would get the outer airlock door—" Benny nodded, dropping into a seat and muttering something into their wavelink. The ship hummed to life, and a moment later the outer doors hissed open. "And I guess this is where we find out if they bothered to lock down our ship when they locked us up," said Joska. "Savina, your ship. Give me control if you want me to get us off." Savina tapped her wavelink through to the ship's controls. "Authorize Joska to pilot," she snapped. Joska hit the controls, and the ship lurched up and forward. Savina barely had time to notice, with a hint of relief, the government agent's ship still parked in the hangar bay. And then they were out, the airlock doors sliding closed behind them. She watched the ship's screen as they shot out into the darkness. The dying ship behind them glowed like a beacon on the screen. The small flickers of escape pods flared brightly for the briefest moment as they left the airlocks, tiny dots against the main ship's massive hull, which itself was a tiny dot in comparison to the expanse of space surrounding them. They flickered out like fireflies as the dolphin shot forward. Joska bent grimly over the controls. And then there was a burst of blinding light, swallowed up almost as quickly by the vacuum as the brief flashes from the fleeing escape pods. Then there was nothing at all, except a halo of dust and debris expanding slowly outward. Savina stood stunned for a long moment. At last, she glanced around the cabin at the others. "Savina?" asked Benny in a small voice. "What happened?" "The ship's fuel storage must have lost pressure," said Savina. Her own voice sounded hollow in her ears. "They're gone. The ship. All of them." Benny's face was cut with shock, and looking at them, Savina felt a quick pang of worry. Rafael sat stoically, staring straight ahead, but she could once again see the hint of tears in his eyes. And Joska. Even without gravity, her posture was slumped, the expression on her face raw, sick horror. Chapter 34. Alba. Alba stared out the plex window of the pod into the blackness of space surrounding them. The remnants of the ship expanded outward in a sparkling arc, like the drift of tiny seedlings from an angel hair flower plucked by a child and puffed free from its stem for a wish. It was hard to comprehend the violence and death that accompanied that gently expanding halo. More space dust to float through the next portal that opens, murmured Aran, a note of bitterness in his voice. He was stroking the hideous, venomous creature that was currently cuddled in his lap, its tentacles wrapped protectively around him. Maybe that's all it was, after all that, said Istve quietly. Just ships broken up by the portal itself? Aran glanced up at them with a quick, brief smile. Maybe. Alba could hear in his voice that he didn't believe it. To be honest, neither did she. But she found she was grateful to Istve for making the comment regardless. It was something, at least, to hold on to. And the great mystery itself knew how badly they needed that right now. She glanced around the tiny, cramped pod. It had been built to fit four and had been designed for utility rather than comfort. Aside from the pilot's seat, the only places to sit were on the small sleeping pods, which were stacked almost atop each other, or on the narrow strip of bench between them. With Feliu laid carefully in one of the sleeping pods and Josip in the pilot's seat, the other four passengers, plus the tentacled death beast, were packed in shoulder to shoulder. Alba turned back to stare out the window, a strange, hollow emptiness sitting in her chest. She'd traveled off-planet before, of course, in the execution of her duties. But this, cast adrift in an overcrowded escape pod, in a place so remote that without the portal, none of them would have reached it in their lifetimes, or their grandchildren's lifetimes, even on a generation ship. So distant, in fact, that with the portal closed, their chances of getting back were virtually nil, and even if they found a planet, with no idea whether its inhabitants would help them or murder them. If someone had told her that she'd find herself in this position, she would have laughed in their faces. And yet, here she was. She'd lived through plenty of hopeless events in the course of her life, and each time, through a combination of iron determination and sharp intelligence, she'd been able to force things to work out in her favor, or at the least, had survived them. And she'd come to conclude that nothing was really as hopeless as it seemed, once the dust settled. She glanced over at the unconscious Feliu with a slightly bitter smile. He'd been right. She'd come to believe in her own invincibility. She sighed and leaned wearily back against the uncomfortable side of the pod. One look at Feliu reminded her of how very false her own vision of her abilities had rung, when it came down to it. There was a sharp, insistent beep from the pod's control panel, and Alba's mind jerked back to the present. Josip turned quickly to the control panel, and she could see the tension in his shoulders as he bent over it. She could feel the tension in her own shoulders. What else could possibly go wrong? Or more to the point, how much more of things going wrong would any of them survive? And then his tense form relaxed, and he laughed softly, turning back to them. We just might have had a stroke of luck. We just might have been unbelievably, incredibly lucky. What is it? Aran asked, standing quickly. There's a planet ahead. It was hidden behind the ship, but it looks like it's within easy range of the pod's capabilities. Maybe 30, 40 planetary hours away, well, within the capacity of our supplies and oxygen. Aran had come to crouch beside Josip, and she could see the blossoming interest on his face, rapidly drowning out both the terror and the despair. I have some equipment we can hook into the pod's sensors. Aran's voice was brightening with excitement. It doesn't have a long range on its own, but added to the pod's capabilities, we may be able to pick up whether or not there are life forms as we get closer. Granted, the presence of life forms doesn't mean the planet's habitable for humans, he added, glancing reflexively at the oddly shaped lump on his shoulder, its tentacles dangling down his back. But at least it raises the chances. Josip nodded, and Aran bent over the controls beside him, pulling what looked like a sort of scanner from a pouch around his waist. Alba glanced around the cabin again. Istve was leaned back against the pod's side, eyes closed, body slack with exhaustion, mouth hanging slightly open. Inez hunched in her seat, a disk opened in front of her with a thick spread of documents displayed on it, some of which Alba recognized as the strange scratchings that might have been a language that they'd found on the box that had passed through the portal. She looked just as young and timid as ever, but Alba had spent enough time around her to know that neither youth nor timidity would affect the keenness of her mind. Alba smiled to herself softly. It took its own type of courage, really, to keep going even when you felt so far out of your depth it could take your breath away. Feliu was still resting where they'd laid him. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell more evenly since Istve and Aran had treated the wound. Aran had assured her the wound was a clean one, and it should heal quickly. Perhaps he wasn't a doctor, but he was clearly very familiar with biological processes, and besides that, well, she found she trusted his judgment. She turned back to the window, staring out at the place where the portal had been. It was now gone so thoroughly that she could only identify it by marking the place of the spreading cloud of debris that had once been their ship. There was something cold inside her, a chunk of ice in her chest that wouldn't melt. Just as well. If it did, if for one moment she allowed herself to contemplate the enormity of what had happened, her heart might simply stop beating with the horror of it. The sheer number of people killed, their bodies scattered through space, no remains to bring home to loved ones who might spend their entire lives never knowing what had happened. And she'd been the one to propose this mission. It had been Cavaco who'd forced them to go forward when she would have turned back. But she couldn't escape the cold, hard fact that if it hadn't been for her, those frozen, lifeless bodies might still be warm and alive. "You should get some sleep, madam." She started and glanced up to see Josip, crouched in the narrow confines of the pod. He was smiling at her, lines of good humor creasing around his eyes. And she found herself smiling back, despite everything. "So should you," she said. His smile broadened. "I intend to. I've set in a course, and the pod should do very well on autopilot until we get closer." Alba glanced around the cabin once more. Inez was still huddled over her translation documents, but Aran seemed to have taken Josip's advice. The sleeping Istve had been transferred to one of the pods, and Aran stretched out on the floor beneath them. The murder beast splayed out on his chest and eyeing the rest of them suspiciously. That still left them short, one pod. Alba hesitated, but Inez looked up from her work and managed a small smile. "It's fine, Madam Chief Justice," she said. "I won't be able to get to sleep until I've gone over these documents a couple more times, and that'll take me a few planetary hours." Alba raised an eyebrow, but the girl looked so pitifully hopeful, like a puppy waiting for a bone, that Alba gave a curt nod. "Thank you, Inez." She climbed into one of the remaining sleeping pods, pulled it shut, and drifted into an exhausted slumber. She woke to Aran's excited exclamation and rolled over stiffly, hitting the button to unseal the sleeping pod. It sprang open, and she blinked at the disorienting flood of light in her face. "Look!" She could make out Aran's words now, instead of just the tone. "Look at the concentration right there. That's got to be a settlement of some sort. And that's only the side of the planet that we can see from our position." The young scientist sounded utterly delighted, as if the prospect of running into an entire settlement of alien life forms with questionable motives was the most wonderful thing he could imagine. Alba sat up, blinking the sleep from her eyes, to see Josip and Aran huddled together over the control panel. "I suggest putting us down around here," said Aran, leaning over to touch something on the screen. "It's within a day or so's walk of the settlement, and it looks like there'll be shelter. We can set up the protection screen and gather all the survivors together, and then see if we can make contact with the life forms and determine whether or not they're sapient." Josip nodded. "I'll put out a beacon for the other pods and shuttles. You want to give the soldiers who are bloody shooting at you another chance?" Istve's voice was groggy with sleep, but still managed to sound grumpy. Alba turned to see them sitting up in their pod, looking pale and weak, and thoroughly irritated at the world in general. "Istve, we can't just leave people to die," said Aran. "Anyways, you saw what happened last time Ani got angry. I don't think they'll bother us too much." Alba shot the scientist a quick look. She was somehow quite certain that this was a story she did not wish to hear. Istve snorted, but Aran had already turned his attention back to the scanner, his eyes lit with interest. Alba found she was smiling, despite herself. "Madam?" She turned to see Feliu, sitting up rather stiffly. His voice was hoarse and cracked, and she could hear the pain in it. But, as Aran had predicted, he seemed to be recovering. At least, his face had regained some of its natural color. "What are your plans now?" he asked softly. She wanted to sag back into the sleeping pod, close her eyes, and just for a moment pretend the weight of this entire mission didn't rest on her, but she couldn't. In the end, she was responsible for this, for everything that had happened up to this point, and everything that would happen after, and perhaps that weight, the weight of the lives lost and the lives still to save, was too great for one person to bear. But bear it she must. She took a deep breath. "As far as I'm concerned, nothing substantial has changed. I am still the leader of a diplomatic mission. We still have a strong chance of making contact with the beings who, presumably, sent us the items through the portal in the first place. I intend, therefore, to attempt to regroup as much of the diplomatic party as possible once we arrive on the planet, and then initiate contact with any sapient life forms we may encounter." The portal is closed, madam," said Filio. "Well, if the life forms behind the portal are responsible for its closure, perhaps they can be induced to reopen it, and if it is purely a natural phenomenon, perhaps they will at the least be able to give us an idea of when it might reopen on its own. I refuse to give our situation up as hopeless until I have a much stronger cause to do so," she said briskly. She could feel all their eyes on her now, and she hoped, vaguely, that she sounded more certain than she felt. "Yes, madam," said Felia at last. "I suppose you're right." Alba sighed and leaned back against the wall of the pod. Despite her brave words, she was at heart a realist. She knew very well that, in the end, the final objective of her grand efforts may shift to simply a desperate bid to save the lives of the 5 other passengers sharing the escape pod with her. But as she looked around at their weary, exhausted faces, she realized with abrupt clarity that if saving these people was the only thing she accomplished, in the end, she would not feel the loss of her hoped-for grand legacy nearly as sharply as she would have imagined. When at last the escape pod burned through the atmosphere and set down gently in a clearing amid the dense greenery of the planet, everyone in the pod had their faces glued to the Plex windows. Aran, in particular, looked almost ready to faint for joy at the prospect of likely losing his life to some vicious alien life form. "It looks like the atmosphere is oxygen-based, if we couldn't already tell from the plant life," he murmured, studying a sensor in his hand. "And I don't see traces of any dangerous gases. We should be able to breathe without assistance." Istvay had already gotten to their feet and was pulling down the emergency kits. "First item of business is to get to a shelter. Something stronger than this pod, if possible. Maybe a cave. Josip, put out the scanners and see what you can find." Josip nodded and turned back to the control panel. "Aran," said Alba quietly. He turned to her, eyes still lit up with repressed excitement, and she sighed. "Aran, what are your intentions going forward? May I count you as a member of our diplomatic party?" For a moment he hesitated, and she saw the way his eyes flicked to Istvay. She followed his gaze. Even her untrained eye could see the unhealthy hollows under their cheekbones, the deepening circles under their eyes that were far too prominent to have come simply from the strain and exhaustion of the last few days. "My intention is to find the cure," said Aran, in a low voice, turning back to her. "That's why I came on this mission in the first place. I'll get the rest of you somewhere safe first. And as long as it looks like diplomacy is our best option for finding the cure, I'll be whatever part of your diplomatic party you want me to be. But I am damn well finding that cure if I have to die to do it." There was a fierceness to his expression that left her in no doubt of his sincerity. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose that's acceptable," she said quietly. And for the first time since she'd known him, he flashed her a quick, genuine smile that changed the entire look of his face. Istvay turned back, holding out a loosely filled knapsack. Aran took it and slung it over his shoulders, the murder beast shifting out of the way for it, then resettling herself in what was clearly a practiced dance. "I found something, not too far distant," said Josip, looking up from the scanner. "I think it might serve. I'll send the coordinates through to you." A moment later, Alba's retinal screen blinked with the alert for an incoming transmission. Istve gave a deep sigh, shouldering their own pack, and glanced at the door with clear reluctance. "Well, I suppose we'd better," they said. Aran nodded, clearly giddy at the prospect of stepping out into the jungle hellscape waiting for them. He tightened his grip on a stun pistol, and the murder beast gave a small hiss, pulling herself more tightly down on his shoulders. "Aran," Istve began. Aran turned to them, rolling his eyes. "I know, be careful, I get it. But Pishti, there's probably things out there no one has seen before." "You're not making me feel any better about this," Istve grumbled. With obvious hesitance, they hit the controls for the hatch, and it hissed and sprang open. The wet heat of the jungle, rolling up the short loading ramp, hit them like an oncoming transport, and Alba almost staggered under it. Aran hardly seemed to notice, though, his gaze fixed on the scenery outside, his grin almost wider than his face. The moment the ramp descended, he stepped outside cautiously. They all watched him as he reached the end of the ramp and took a few steps into the jungle. He pulled out a sensor and turned in a slow circle, holding it out, then turned back to the ship. "There are life forms everywhere, but I haven't calibrated this thing to the new environment, so it'll be picking up everything, insects, worms, what have you. You may as well come on out, since—" His words cut off abruptly, and he spun around as something burst through the trees behind him. Alba caught a confused impression of a mass of muscles, claws, and fangs, and Istve shouted in alarm, starting down the ramp. And then something launched itself from Aran's shoulder. The massive cat-like beast howled as whatever it was landed on its back, and it twisted to tear at its tormentor. Then its body went rigid and it dropped to the ground, twitching. Aran looked horrified. "Ani!" he scolded. "We've talked about this. There were 100 other ways we could have dealt with the problem. Now look, it's dead, and I didn't even get a chance to—" He yelped, jumping forward, and pulled Ani, now turned a deep green, off the monster with some effort as she clung on with her tentacles. "Don't eat that! You don't know what it is. It might make you sick." It took Alba a moment to realize with some bemusement that the scientist wasn't horrified by the fact he'd almost been taken apart by something longer than the entire escape pod, with fangs the length of his hand, but for the fact that his tentacle beast might get a stomachache. Grudgingly, Ani allowed herself to be pulled away, and Aran gathered her gently in his arms, stroking her. "Like I said, you can come out," he said over his shoulder. In front of him, the monster's form was slowly flattening, presumably as its insides were liquefied by whatever Ani had injected into it. Istve sighed, shaking their head. "He means well," they said wryly. "I suppose he's right. We may as well go out. He and I both have stun guns, and the rest of you can take the rifles from the soldiers. And there's always Ani, if things get bad." Alba glanced around at the terrified faces of the others. If she were being honest with herself, her own legs were feeling distinctly shaky after the last 5 minutes. But she straightened, taking one of the rifles from where Istve had laid them on the seat, although what good it would do her, she had no idea, considering it would take her probably 5 minutes to figure out how to work the damn thing, and forced her feet to move her towards the exit. Aran held out a hand to help her down, and she took it graciously, steadfastly avoiding looking at Ani, who was snuggled in the crook of his other arm. When they'd all disembarked, they had to wait another few minutes as Aran studied with every semblance of complete fascination the dead creature lying before them, and then launched into a technical discussion with Istve which Alba couldn't follow and didn't care to. At last, though, she cleared her throat loudly. "It appears the sun is sinking below its zenith. If we wish to find shelter before dark, I suggest we start immediately." Aran looked up, clear reluctance on his features, but he nodded. "You're right. Josip, the other pods and shuttles should be coming down close to where we are, correct?" Josip nodded. "I set the beacon at any rate. If they're looking for a safe place to land, they'll probably try to set down near it, seeing as we made it down in one piece." Aran nodded, glancing around at the thick vegetation surrounding them. "All right. I'll go with you to the shelter and help get things set up. Once we've done that, I'll come back to look for survivors. Tomorrow we can start towards the settlement, see what we can find." Alba closed her eyes for a moment. For some reason, huddling in a shelter as the sky darkened overhead, without the exuberant presence of the young scientist and his frazzled best friend, was a more daunting prospect than she liked to admit. But he was right. Any other survivors would likely need their help. She looked up and nodded. "Thank you, Aran. That is acceptable." She took a deep breath. "Now, if you would be so good as to lead the way." Chapter 35. Savina. Savina stared straight ahead out the window as the dolphin made its slow way towards the gentle curve of the strange planet ahead. Now that they were safe, or at least as safe as they could be, considering they were in an uncharted universe, her adrenaline was giving way to that strange, dull numbness. They were alive, yes, by some frankly unfathomable stroke of luck, but they were trapped, so far beyond anything she knew that there was no way her brain could even comprehend it. Joska sighed, looking up from the control panel. Well, at least we resupplied when we got the thrusters repaired, but this ship wasn't meant to hold more than 6 people. We have limited fuel, and no idea how long the supplies will have to last us. "The ship's in bad shape herself," Rafael muttered. "When we got caught in that aftershock, it blew some of the systems, nothing major, but we'll be limping along at about half our normal speed until we find a place to put down and fix her." Joska tipped her head back against the seat wearily. "Well, this may be the worst mess we've been in for a while, but considering our run of luck lately, I can't say it's entirely unexpected." There was a dry humor to her tone that almost made Savina stare. This woman had been ripped away from everything she knew and shoved into a nightmare. In her place, Savina would have been furious, vowing vengeance on whoever had brought her there, which meant in this case, of course, herself and Benny. But the captain didn't seem particularly angry, just resigned. And once again, Savina wondered what this woman's life had been like, that this was her reaction to a disaster of this magnitude. "Joska," she said at last. The woman glanced up at her. Savina took a deep breath. "Why?" she asked at last, bluntly. "Why did you come back to save Benny and me?" The captain studied her for a moment. At last, she shook her head and gave a soft, rueful chuckle. "I suppose I'm a glutton for punishment," she said. "Seeing as you hijacked my ship, threatened to kill me more times than I can quite frankly count, and got all of us into this mess in the first place." Savina narrowed her eyes, and the captain's chuckle turned into a genuine laugh. She turned back to her controls, punching in a couple more coordinates, then leaned back. "I guess I couldn't bear to see 2 kids blown up in an explosion like that, not even terrors like the 2 of you," she said at last, not looking at Savina. "You're a bad one, through and through, and you've proved it to me, but I have a niece who'd be around your age, and," she shrugged, "I guess maybe I know what it's like to be young and scared. And so maybe I can't blame you as much as I should. Probably be the death of me one of these days." Savina stared at the back of the woman's head, the gray streak through her thick black hair, pulled back into its no-nonsense ponytail. A week ago, she would have brushed the woman's words off as nothing but a cynical ploy to get Savina to let down her guard. She'd known you couldn't trust someone who was orthodox. You couldn't trust anyone. If you didn't hit first and hard, you'd be killed. That was how the system worked. And then this damn woman who she'd kidnapped and threatened had saved her life. Benny's life, too, when Savina wouldn't have been able to herself. Rafael stiffened suddenly, glancing over at Joska. "Captain," he said, a twinge of excitement in his voice. "Now the debris is cleared and our sensors are working. I'm picking up a beacon. It's saying there's a safe place to land, and survivors." He reached forward, his thick finger marking a pulsing dot on the outline of the planet's surface on the screen. A slow smile spread across Joska's face. "Well, that's the best damn news I've heard all day." She paused. "Not that there's been a lot of competition for the title." She glanced around the cabin. "I'll set a course for the emergency beacon unless I hear any objections." Savina wasn't inclined to disagree, and Benny didn't speak, just faced out the window, their expressions still glassy with shock. "It'll still take us a while to get down there," said Rafael in his gruff voice. "No need to stay on the flight deck the whole time." The dismissal was rude, perhaps, but Savina didn't really care. Her brain was too full, too many thoughts swirling insistently through her head for her to be able to make sense of them around anyone else. So she just nodded and made her slow way back to her cabin. Nicolau, under Joska's orders, was organizing the survivors, directing them into anywhere on the ship with a room. Savina paused a moment, watching him, and something tightened in her chest. Her baby brother. She could still see in his face traces of the 5-year-old who'd played in the yard of the farmhouse near the compound. But he wasn't a baby any longer. He straightened and glanced over, catching her eye. She dropped her gaze quickly and went to brush past him, but he grabbed her arm. "Wait, please. I need to talk to you." Nicolau's voice was rough, and she glanced up despite herself. His face was set and pale, and there were tear streaks down his cheeks. Again, her chest tightened painfully. He'd been happy before she arrived. She'd never meant for this to happen. She'd never meant for him to have a reason to know who she was. "Look," he continued, "I don't know you, but you saved me, only me. My friends were back there, and now they're dead. Why?" She studied him for a long moment. Are your parents safe?" she asked at last. She wasn't sure why she'd asked the question, only that he'd looked so happy with them the last time she'd seen him. He nodded. "Yes, they're back on Colorida." He paused. "Do you know them?" She gave a quick, brusque jerk of her head. "Yes." He nodded slowly, releasing her arm as if he took that as her answer. It wasn't really a lie, and he didn't need to know the rest, not right now. Maybe not ever. The tiny cabin that Benny and Savina shared had been left empty, and she pulled herself down the corridor and slipped inside. She was alive, and Benny was alive, and they'd saved Nicolau. She should be desperately grateful, but she found it difficult to feel anything at all. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting there when there was a soft tap on the door. "Yes," she called listlessly. The door opened, and Joska poked her head in. "Mind if I come in?" she asked, and Savina didn't have the energy to tell her no. The captain pushed herself into the room, glancing around, then, with a shrug, pulled herself down onto Benny's cot, anchoring herself with the straps. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Joska said, "So, who's Nicolau? A lover?" Savina almost laughed. "Brother. And he doesn't know you?" She nodded and didn't offer an explanation. Joska didn't ask for one, just gave her a wry smile. "Well, he seems like a nice enough boy. Goes to show it's not all about genetics." Savina turned to glower at the woman, and she chuckled, then sobered again, still watching Savina. Savina turned away, not willing to let the captain see her discomfort. For a few moments more, they sat in silence. At last, Joska said, "You all right?" Savina looked up in surprise at the sympathy in her tone. Joska's gaze was sharp, but kind, and for just a moment Savina was tempted, for the first time in her life, to open her mouth and tell this strange, quiet woman everything. About her family back home, about the compound, about the dull, routine terror of growing up in a place where everything was a threat and everyone a danger, about trying to keep Benny safe, about what she'd done to keep Nicolau safe, how she'd always been certain there'd been meaning behind what she'd gone through, but that now, suddenly, she didn't know anymore. How she didn't know anymore what was true and what was a lie, how lost she was, how afraid, how alone. Joska didn't speak, her eyes thoughtful, her gaze penetrating. Savina managed a quick smile. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "Just a bit of a shock is all." The captain was still watching her, and it was obvious she didn't believe Savina's reassurances, but she only nodded noncommittally. "Nothing wrong except for the obvious, you mean?" she said with a small grin. Savina's smile grew genuine for just a moment, then she looked away. Joska shifted on the bunk. "So," she said quietly, "what do you suggest we do next, since this is your ship?" Savina turned to stare at her, and Joska chuckled again. "No need to look at me like that. We're together now, at least until we can figure out a way to get out of this alive. I'm assuming you won't stab Rafael and me in the back until you know you won't need us any longer." There was a hint of amusement in her voice, though, that told Savina she wasn't really serious. "Rafel's been taking scans of the communications," Joska continued. "The diplomatic party survived, it appears, or most of them anyway. From what I know of Alba, she's bull-headed enough to try to start negotiations, portal or no. Joining up with them might be our best hope. At the very least, if we're in a group big enough, the aliens might not be able to kill us all at once." Savina sucked in a breath at the mention of Alba's name, and she wasn't prepared for the quick, hot surge of rage that flashed through her. Damn that woman to hell. Everything had been fine before Alba had sent an agent after Savina, cobbled together a mission through the portal that had dragged Nicolau along. And since then, Savina's entire life had gone up in smoke. Everything she'd known, everything she'd believed, everything she'd been sure of, gone in the course of a few relentless days. Even if everything had been a lie, even if Savina was only collateral damage and the warrant for her issued as payback for a murdered counselor, with the thoughtless confidence of a bureaucrat trying to solve a political dilemma, it didn't honestly matter. Alba knew Savina's past. Alba was a judge with a reputation for harsh justice. Alba would kill her, and Benny and Nicola would be caught up in the aftermath, if they weren't simply killed as well. Whatever had happened, whatever the reason for it, Alba had to die. The captain was still watching her. Savina nodded absently. "You're right. That's probably our best option. Get around as many people as we can, and hope there's safety in numbers. And I doubt anyone will recognize us unless that government agent of yours managed to get on her ship and off that place in the few seconds before it blew up." Savina nodded again, and felt a small smile growing in the corner of her mouth. Joska had been right. They were in this together, at least until they found a way back. But that might come sooner than the woman imagined. And even if it didn't, well, they'd all be mixed in with the rest of the survivors soon enough. She'd no longer be Savina's responsibility, certainly. And out here, far away from everything they knew, everyone guarding the judge would be watching for aggression from alien life forms. Which would make things much, much easier. "You're looking happy," said Joska, a note of question in her voice. Savina turned to her, letting her dimples show. "I've been thinking about what you said. You're right, you never know. We may survive this after all." Joska nodded warily, unstrapping herself from the seat. "Well, if you're in agreement, I'll head back to the controls. We'll reach the planet in 15 or so planetary hours, give or take." Savina nodded, still smiling as Joska left, closing the door behind her. A few more hours, then Alba would be dead, and Savina would be free, and everything else she could work out from there. She hummed to herself quietly as she gathered her things in preparation for their landing. Chapter 36. Aran. Aran sighed and leaned wearily against one of the strange, rough-barked trees. He'd learned from experience that the trees with smooth bark were less trees than they were carnivorous, predatory botanical hunters lying in wait for unsuspecting prey. But honestly, he'd take the long cut down his arm in a heartbeat in exchange for the absolutely fascinating look at the inside of the thing's mouth. Ani had tried to eat it in return, and he'd barely managed to pull her off. Ani, perched on his shoulder, made an inquisitive sound. He shook his head. "It's nothing, sweetheart," he murmured. "Just tired." Tired was an understatement. He'd left the others at the edge of a large overhang of rock at the base of a cliff that rose 20 meters out of the jungle. He and Istvay had examined it for danger, and then set up the protective force field. With the rock at their back, it should hold off even whatever it was that Ani had killed when they'd first arrived. The two of them had helped the others set camp inside the safety of the force field. Then Aran had left the rest of the party with Istvay and headed back into the jungle to search for survivors, much to Istvay's vocal dissatisfaction. In the end, though, Istvay's poison-induced weakness aside, it had been painfully clear that the tiny, helpless group of survivors wouldn't last long alone. None of the others, with the possible exception of Inez, knew anything at all about surviving in the wild. And nor could Aran and Istvay abandon the other potential survivors in the jungle, especially not with night coming on. Besides, Aran had pointed out reasonably he had Ani. Only something very stupid would make the mistake of attacking him while he had Ani with, and it would only make that mistake once. Istve had at last, reluctantly, agreed, because they hadn't really had any choice. Since then, Aran had shuttled 3 groups of survivors back to the shelter through a jungle thick enough that each step was an effort. And now, as dark was falling, he was coming back for one last sweep before true nightfall. He didn't mind being alone with Ani, though. He needed the time to think. Alba was right. Trying diplomacy was probably the first step, at least until he could understand the language and knew the lay of the land. But as he trekked back and forth through the jungle, Istve's words had rung over and over in his ears. Even if you won't believe me that you're the best person on this damn ship, they don't have any better options right now. And that was exactly it. He was the only one Istve had. If they wouldn't take this seriously, if they insisted on being more concerned about Alba's diplomatic mission than finding a cure, it didn't matter. Because Aran might be all they had, but they did have Aran. He would find the cure, or he'd die trying. And if it meant slipping off into the jungle on his own, the moment it became clear that Alba's solution wouldn't work, so be it. The thought should terrify him, probably. Honestly, when he had time to think about it, it probably would. But right now, all he could feel was a weary sort of resolve that had hardened into something steely and unbendable. He would save Istve, no matter what that took. He flipped on his sensor again. He'd calibrated it to scan for humans, and while that meant it wouldn't show him any potentially hostile animals approaching, he wasn't overly concerned. He had Ani, and he had a stun gun, and he'd managed pretty well so far. The sensor beeped, and he sighed and straightened. "Looks like we found someone, Ani." The sensor led him past where most of the other pods had come down, and into a small clearing. And in the clearing, he frowned. It wasn't a pod at all, but some sort of a ship. But it was definitely occupied, and the occupants were definitely human. A young woman stood on the loading ramp, waving at him frantically. She stopped when he turned her way and shot him a brilliant smile. We heard chatter over the wavelengths that someone was bringing survivors in. There was no mistaking the raw, exhausted edge to her voice. "I was hoping you'd come through one more time. I don't particularly like the look of this jungle." Aran smiled back. "It's not as bad as all that. But you're right. You can get yourself in trouble if you're not careful." "You can come out! Someone came for us!" she called back into the ship, and one by one other figures emerged. First, a tall individual who looked a little younger than the girl who'd hailed him, with an androgynous appearance. Dark hair and enough rings and spikes in their lips and ears and eyebrows that they looked a little like they were growing their own defensive armor. Then an older man with light skin, a limp and a scowl. And then a middle-aged woman with a frank, matter-of-fact expression that Aran found himself liking even before she'd said a word. The woman looked him up and down without any trace of awkwardness, then nodded and stepped forward. "I'm Joska. This is Savina and Benny, and this," she gestured to the older man, "is Rafael. The others I don't know. We picked them up from the ship on our way out." Aran shot an inquisitive glance at the ship, and the young woman who'd first hailed him caught the look. "We were on a supply run when everything went sideways," she said with a small shudder. "I never dreamed they wouldn't let us off before they went through the portal, but I guess we got caught in the middle of something. Some soldiers locked us up, and I wasn't sure we'd get out alive at all." Her face was friendly and open, her smile pleasant, her attitude one of guileless cheerfulness. But there hadn't been any supply ships scheduled. Aran knew that from the records Istve had pulled up. "I'm sorry you got caught up in it," he said at last, watching them surreptitiously. Still, he couldn't exactly leave them to die in the jungle, whatever their reason for lying. "I'm going to make a final sweep, and then I'm heading back to the shelter for the last time," he said. "Would you prefer to wait for me here, or would you prefer to come with?" "Come with, please," said the young woman, and something about her tone told him that this, at least, was no ploy. Whatever else she was legitimately terrified of the jungle. He couldn't blame her. If it hadn't been so damn interesting, he probably would have been paralyzed with terror himself. "All right, bring what you need. But only what you need, he cautioned. Walking is hard, and you'll have to carry everything yourselves. I'm going to need both my hands free if I want to keep us alive. 2 return trips through the jungle had showed him this was no exaggeration. When everyone had gathered what pitiful belongings they had, Aran gestured with his head. "Let's go," he said, and they started off into the jungle. "Aran, isn't it?" He looked over, startled, to see that the friendly young woman, Savina, had come up beside him. He frowned. He wasn't accustomed to anyone being able to walk quietly enough to startle him, but then he was tired, and probably hadn't been paying all that much attention. "Yes," he said warily. She smiled, pleasant dimples appearing on her face. "I've heard so much about you. It's so nice to actually meet you, although I have to be honest. I'd have preferred other circumstances." Aran smiled ruefully. "As would I," he murmured. They walked in silence for a few moments. He hoped against hope that she wouldn't start asking about his exploits, or flirting with him, always awkward since he never seemed to be able to figure out when it was happening, which meant it usually ended badly for all involved. But she didn't appear to be contemplating any of those things. Instead, she looked as if she was deep in thought. At last, she looked up again, the dimples on her cheeks reappearing. "You haven't seen the Chief Justice, have you?" The way she asked the question, the delicate hesitation in front of it, made him frown. But it wasn't a secret, and even if it had been, it would have gotten out as soon as they reached the shelter. "Yes," he said. "She's with the others." The girl's smile widened, a happy, infectious grin, and he almost found himself smiling as well, despite everything. "Oh, that's excellent," she said exuberantly. "I've been wanting to meet her ever since I heard she was on the ship." He glanced at her curiously, but he couldn't read anything from her face. He shrugged and turned his attention back to the scanner. He'd bring these people to the shelter, and tomorrow they'd start out for whatever settlement the ship's scanner had picked up. And then, somehow, he would find Istve a cure. The scanner beeped, indicating another group of survivors, and he turned towards the sound, the ragged group of travelers following close behind. Chapter 37. Epilogue. The beast crouched in the jungle, watching the black smoke that curled from the wreck of the tiny craft. The thing had landed ungracefully on the jungle floor, nose first, and tumbled over and over itself before finally coming to rest against a stand of carnivorous trees. The beast had never seen anything like it, but it couldn't be much of a threat. The entire craft was barely longer than the creature's own body. It crouched, its only movement the flicking of its long tail. The smell of burning made it cautious, but it wasn't long before it determined that the thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to move. It padded across the jungle floor in the moonlight, 20-centimeter-long claws retracting delicately. When it was close enough, it reached out and swatted at the mangled metal, then drew quickly back. Still, the thing didn't move, and the beast padded closer, curious. It nudged the craft again, then reached down and nipped at it, making a disgusted face at the taste of burnt metal. And then the craft rocked, and the beast crouched, tail lashing in alarm. From the side opposite, a hatch hissed open. The beast watched warily, and just as it had made up its mind to investigate, a figure emerged from the hatch. It was a woman, with black hair and a tailored gray suit that the creature's eyes skipped over strangely. There was blood smeared across the woman's face and clothing, but she didn't move as if she was badly injured. She stepped out onto the jungle floor, glancing around her languidly and brushing ash off her clothing, and the beast crouched down, sniffing the new scent on the air. The woman glanced at the small sensor strapped to her wrist, and her lips curled up into a smile. She turned towards the darkest part of the jungle, stepping around the carnivorous trees with hardly a glance in their direction, and started into the thick undergrowth. The beast crouched lower, its powerful front quarters bunching. This was something new, certainly, but it smelled eminently eatable, and certainly nothing to pose a challenge to the creature's own supremacy in the jungle. Letting loose a triumphant roar, it leapt. The woman turned casually over her shoulder, pulling a small gun from a holster in her sleeve, and fired. Reka hardly glanced back at the twitching body scant meters away, just slipped the gun back into her sleeve and continued forward, following the small beep of her sensor. By the time half an hour had passed, it had led her to an open clearing some half a kilometer distant, where the vegetation had been burned away. What had caused the damage became apparent a few steps further on, an old, battered spacecraft, gleaming dully in the bright light of the planet's 3 moons. She smiled grimly. Cavaco had pinned all the blame for the job gone wrong on her, and one day, when that Chief Justice fulfilled her promise and gave Reka her life back, she'd pay him for it. But Savina had been the one who caused the job to go wrong in the first place, and she'd always have to be the first one to pay. Reka paused at the edge of the clearing, tapping the scanner on her wrist to check for life forms. Nothing. But then she hadn't expected there to be. Not now. She stepped warily into the clearing and paused at the ship's loading ramp, which gaped open, abandoned. Then she climbed inside. The corridors of the ship were deserted and dirty, as if they'd been trampled over by several pairs of feet. Reka frowned. She'd looked up the information on the woman who'd shot her, the Captain Joska. She couldn't blame the woman for getting dragged into Savina's schemes, and when she shot, the woman had clearly not been aiming to kill. She wasn't the type to kill, and everything Reka had read on her told her that Joska was the type to try to save survivors. But the fact that Savina hadn't stopped her was curious. She paused a moment, then crouched and did a quick DNA scan of the walls. Enough people had touched it that the DNA signatures were a muddled mess. But after a moment, she was able to pick out a familiar signature. She glanced down at the screen, then raised her eyebrows. There was the signature she was looking for. But there were 2 others as well, too similar for it to be a coincidence. Slowly, she smiled. "Savina," she said. "Traveling with family, I see." That was a piece of information she hadn't been given. How interesting. If she'd had time to run her DNA scans after the failed attack, how differently would this job have gone? Interesting to contemplate. But it was a consideration for the past, and there was no point worrying about it now. She made her way back outside and knelt, running her fingers along the broken grass that marked the traveler's footprints. Maybe 5-6 hours since they'd left here. She was late. Still, considering the damage her small craft had taken, she was lucky to have made it at all. And she wasn't one who generally counted on luck to carry through with her plans. The portal through which they'd come had disappeared, but she was practical enough to realize that a portal that could be opened once could be opened again. And when it did, she fully intended to have cleared her name and Savina's debt. The warrant had been flexible on whether Savina needed to come back alive. She hesitated a moment, then slipped a small hollow disk out of her slim jacket pocket and tapped it open. The warrant blinked and glowed to life, bright against the dark of the night, and she studied it. A frank, innocent-looking girl with plump, comfortable curves and a dimpled smile rotated gently. Lifelike, yes, but the hollow image couldn't convey the wickedness in those wide, innocent eyes, the satisfaction in that dimpled smile as Savina plunged her knife into flesh. Reka expanded the screen with her fingers, studying the woman more closely. Savina had proved herself to be more intelligent and more dangerous than Reka had expected. Still, Reka hadn't earned the reputation she had by being afraid of a challenge. "I'm looking forward to our next meeting, Savina," she whispered. She tapped the disc, and the holograph disappeared. She slipped it back into her jacket pocket and glanced around the small clearing one last time. Her lips curved in a slow, dangerous smile, and she stepped out into the jungle, following the bent trail of footsteps. The end.